Hello, Assalamu alaikum everybody. Hope you're all safe, sound, and healthy. And we are going to talk about various different things that some of the oldest civilizations seem to constantly claim that they originated a particular idea, for example, or they were behind a particular kind of clothing or dish or this and that. We tend to hear it a lot from the Chinese, who claim to seem to have invented almost everything on earth. Then we have a similar claim by the Indians. Then we have a similar claim by the Europeans when they talk about the Romans and the Greeks. And the list goes on. Okay, so we do know that there were quite a few of the oldest civilizations that we know of, right? One of them is the Mesopotamian, which is one of the oldest, probably the oldest, amongst the oldest of the ancient civilizations, which is present day Iraq, Baghdad, right? Then we have the Egyptian civilization, we have the Ethiopian civilization. These two are also one of the oldest. As we know, they've been mentioned even pre-biblical times and biblical and in the Quran. So then you have the Indian civilization, which is one of the oldest, and you have the Chinese civilization, which is one of the oldest, right? Now, you have also the Turkics, and we're not talking about the Turkish people, we're talking about the steppes, the nomads and the steppes of the Central Asian region, right? Now, let's talk specifically about the subcontinent, for example. As I said, there was this wave where anything in Japan and Korea, for example, the Chinese will trace it back to the Chinese origins. Or anything even in broader Asia, for example, or even in the West. Now, the thing about the West is, as we know, the West doesn't have much to its name. Okay, historically speaking, you could refer to them if you want to give a blanket view, which obviously is very wrong, but let's just blanket it out, because the West, they like to dumb things down, right? And they like to blanket things. So let's just do the same to them for this, just for this topic. They were basically pirates. They were land and sea pirates. So they lived in the dark ages. They didn't even know what a street light was. So for the longest time, they have been like that. And they were known as rogues, in other words. So they were rogues, and they were not civilized. And, whereas all of these other civilizations had, reached very far. And we know that the West has borrowed heavily from these civilizations, and not without, committing genocide. So the West, wherever they went to find out how is it that the other civilizations were above them or better than them. And then they moved on to slaughter as much as they could or commit genocide. Case in point, Australia, Canada, and the United States of America, which are existing today even on the bodies of the natives, who are now considered minorities in their own land. The owners, the original owners of the land, are minorities. And so you can understand where this imperialistic setup comes from and how they've spread it to their servants in their former colonies, which call themselves governments of those colonies. Okay, none of that. We're not going to digress. So here we are. Let's put it, so we have understood now the whole thing. So now here we have this thing where we're going to stick to the Asian side, okay? So here we have, for example, now the Persians. Sorry, how could I forget when my whole topic revolves around the Persians? So the Persians are also one of the oldest civilizations. And they are actually the oldest civilization to have remained intact, in the sense that they were never conquered or colonized. Probably one of the biggest problems that the West has had with them. So while we're sitting here understanding this whole thing, we can understand a few more things. And that is, how is it that the Persians are one of those who claim to be behind a lot of things that the subcontinent, or the Middle East even in certain cases, or different parts of Asia, that they are influenced by Persian, language structure or by their things or by their dishes. And although where the West is concerned, yes, a lot of it, as we know, is true, because as I said, the West has pretty much borrowed everything that they could from all the other civilizations. There's nothing much that they can call their own, to be very honest. But when we start going a little more deeper into it, then I think that it is again the same thing as the Chinese or as the Turkish, where they start saying, oh no, this comes from us, oh, this comes from us. Oh, whereas, again, as I said, many of it could be true. But there are many things actually that predated even them, in the sense that in the subcontinent, the influence of those things that are claimed to be Persian are actually not Persian at all. They predate them, because remember, the Indian civilization, which was one of the oldest civilizations, again, was the Indus civilization. And that is which is today's Pakistan, right? So where you have the Mohenjo-daro and the Harappa and all. And now here, as we know, they were basically farmers, and not just farmers, but they actually also made weapons. And they are also one of the earliest influencers of clothing and weapons and farming techniques. In fact, In fact, I'll remind you again, which I've mentioned in some of my previous podcasts, that this existing canal system that we have in Pakistan, which is known as the largest irrigation system in the world, this too sits on the original irrigation system that was, designed and made and constructed and, planned by the Indus civilization. So let's see now. Let's try to get a hang of it, right? We have, as I said, we had prior to the dominance of classical Persian, okay, as the region's elite lingua franca, waves of Central Asian steppe pastoralites and nomads, including the Bronze Age Indo-Aryans and later the Iron Age Saka. Now, for Saka, I think Saka, I think in English you would refer to them as the Scythians, okay? Then you have the Yuezhi and you have the kashanas. We especially know about the kashanas, right? I think that is one of the most well-known of the older tribes that we know of. So because they basically settled in, which is, now Pakistan, or which was then the Indus Valley. And they massively reshaped the South Asian clothing, as I said. They reshaped the technology, the weaponry, the administrative styles, right? And so when Islamic Turco-Persianate empires later consolidated power, they remained, when they remained in power, then what they did is that they renamed these pre-existing steppe items using Persian terminology, creating the false modern impression that the objects themselves were Persian inventions, which obviously, as we know, they're not. So let us look at some of those primary historical items and concepts that originated in the Central Asian steppes, but were, they were basically Persianized in name. One of them is, as I said, clothing and apparel, because I actually did a post on this. I wrote down a whole detail on the shalwar kameez especially, and the tunic and the coat, which was again borrowed, one of the coat versions, which is the waistcoat or the vest, that was borrowed by the British in 1666 when their king decided that, he wants a vest to be included in the British clothing. That was heavily borrowed from the subcontinent, okay, which was again originally Central Asian steppe, right? And we'll come to that too. So the tunic and the coat, that is the kurta and the sherwani, right? So the tunic is the kurta and the coat is the sherwani. As you see, the names themselves also tell you that these are not indigenous to the subcontinent, as in they're not indigenous to the Indian, as in the Dravidian part of India, where you had only saris and lungis and dhotis, because saris and lungis and dhotis are unstitched pieces of clothing. And as we know, for example, the Thai and the Indian indigenous clothings were basically unstitched clothings. The concept of stitched clothing was brought in by the steppes. And as we know, if you look at the DNA of the Pakistanis, we really are descendants. We really are direct descendants of those steppes, or we really are direct descendants of the Indus Valley Civilization, to a large extent. So the thing is that these were later on referred to as Aryans, the Central Asians, the steppes and all. They were who we call the Aryans or the Aryans, right? So that is why in India then you had predominantly two of these main ethnic groups. One was the Indian ethnic group, that was the Dravids, and then the others were these who came from Central Asia and settled in and made the Indus Valley Civilization and created it all, and they were Aryans, referred to as that. In India, generally, that is who we have always referred to as Aryans. So, the steppe reality behind the kurta and the sherwani. So, long before Islamic eras, heavy stitched tunics and overlapping front buttoned winter coats were brought to South Asia by the Sakas and the Kashanas to survive horse riding in harsh climates. This is physically proven by the famous headless statue of the Kushana emperor Kanishka, that is in 2nd century CE, wearing a heavy tunic and long quilted coat. The Persianized rename, so the words jama, which means coat or garment, and kurta, which is tunic from the Persian kurta, and eventually sherwani, associated with the region of Shirvan, rebranded this steppe-style tailored clothing into a Persian aesthetic. So as we know, because similar styles of clothing were found in Persia, because remember, this is all that one big part of Asia. So from the Persian region onwards to the Central Asian and all, because they're all one way or the other connected to each other. So obviously there were lots of similarities in clothings and all. And because the Persians noticed those similarities in clothings, they decided, oh, this is just like our jama and this is just like our kurta, and it is also called kurta, so let's just move on and call it that. And oh, this is very similar to our sherwani. So they like just, although actually they had nothing similar to Sherwani, to be honest. It's just that somehow or the other they managed to associate it with the region of Shirvan, and they're like, oh, let's call it a Sherwani. So the names themselves will tell you that they have no indigenous roots to India, but at the same time, the names, if you look at the original names, they will tell you that they are indigenous to the Indus Valley Civilization, or indigenous to the Central Asian civilization that became the Indus Valley Civilization, the steppes, the Kushanas, right? So this garment that is now known as the subcontinental garment, or that is known particularly, which the Indians, again, as I said, the Indians also have this very bad habit of trying to make everything Indian. And they're like, oh, this is ethnic wear. This is not the Indian ethnic wear. No, this is the Indus Valley Civilization ethnic wear, which is now Pakistan. So that is why Pakistan rightfully owns these clothings when we talk about the kurta and the sherwani and all. And also why it was always referred to as Muslim garments, because again, when the Persians came over, when the Turkish people came over, many of the similarity in those garments made it easier for them to adapt or adopt that fusion, that were made by the Muslim elites of the subcontinent. And so they had Persianized those names, and then they became, the thing that was known to be the apparel of the Muslims of India, or the elites of, or later on also the elites of India, right? Sorry. Now, the high boots concept. Here's another thing. This is the jutti and the moza. Again, you would think that the Chinese, because in all their historic period dramas, you will see the Chinese wearing those high boots that are, similar to socks, and sometimes they have those shoe-looking socks and this and that, and you would think, oh, the Chinese invented it. No, the steppe reality. Barefoot or sandal-clad ancient South Asians did not wear leather riding boots, right? The steppe horsemen brought thick, structured leather boots designed to lock into stirrups. So the Kushana coins explicitly depict kings wearing these thick, pointed, or heavy-soled boots. So those are your high boots, right? The Persian rename, now the thing, that's where the Persian came in again. So the items were later systematically swallowed by the Persian terminology of moza, boots, and paizar or pezar, footwear, making modern South Asians think that leather footwear culture arrived exclusively via Iran, which again, as we know, it didn't, because it was already a part of this region, which is today's Pakistan. So a part of India had already been wearing this stuff. Okay, and here's a funny thing, another fun fact of linguistic evolution. Although the Persianized, in the Persian language, the moza is referred to as the shoes, the boots themselves, but in Urdu, the moza, that Persian origin word moza, has become socks. And I guess it is understandable because, as I said, our socks are like, those high boots, in the sense the length, they come up to our thighs, or I'm saying thighs, they come up to our calves, or our ankles. So they're like, so from that it grew. From that, the concept of moza evolved from those high boots to your socks. Now, warfare and equestrian technology. You have the chainmail and the iron armor. Okay, that is the zari, I think they call it in the Persian language. Now, here's the steppe reality again. The technology of cataphracts, that is the fully armored cavalry, and heavy chainmail scales was pioneered by the Scythian and Saka nomads of the Eurasian steppe. Yeah. So they introduced scaled iron armor to the subcontinent during their migrations in the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE. But the Persianized renaming again began when the technology was renamed under the military vocabulary of the Delhi Sultanate, using the Persian zari for chainmail armor and koh for the helmet, obscuring its ancient nomadic origins. Then we have the compound bow. Okay, that is the kaman. As we know, we have the tir kaman, right? In Urdu, even we call it tir and kaman. Tir being the arrow and kaman being the bow, right? Now, here's again another reality behind it. While ancient South Asians used massive bamboo long bows, as described in the epics, the compact, deadly, composite, recurved bow made of horn, wood, and sinew was a distinct steppe nomadic invention, optimized for horse archery. Remember, these were horsemen, and these were nomads, and they traveled, and they had horses, and so they had to wear clothes and shoes and had weapons in accordance to their lifestyle. So this vocabulary of medieval archery became completely Persianized with kaman, which, as I said, is the bow, and tir, the arrow, and tarkash, the quiver, erasing the distinct material lineage of the steppe bow that had already been used in India for centuries. Right? Now, governance and social hierarchy. Provincial governance, which became subedar. And now, of course, we have reduced subedar into a constable. Yeah, literally. Now when we call somebody a subedar, in our mind is a police constable. But okay, originally, the practice of dividing an empire into military administrative units ruled by a military governor was introduced to South Asia by the Indo-Scythians, the Sakas. Right? They called their governors satraps. Okay? And this was a title borrowed from Old Persian. Now, here's again another twist. So, although the satraps, the title was borrowed from the Old Persian, but it was deployed purely by steppe rulers across northern India. Right? And then obviously, again, when the Mughal Empire reorganized this exact structural logic, they started renaming the provinces to Suba. So a Suba is a province, which we still call, as you know, in Pakistan, we say we have 4 Subas, or Sube. Sube is plural of Suba. So, hamare 4 Sube hain, right? We have 4 provinces. So they renamed provinces to Suba, and the governors to Subedar or Nazim. Actually, we call it Nazim even today. Now, as I said, now we do not use the word Subedar for governor, we use Nazim, which is more along the sides of a mayor, actually. Now, for us, a Nazim is more like a mayor. And so, this whole reframing of the old Kushana structural reality as modern Islamic Persian administrative design was done under the Mughal Empire. Okay? Now, royal titling and court protocol, the Shah Badshah thing. Again, as we know, we keep referring to the Persians, or the Persians keep referring to themselves as if they invented that whole thing. But the idea of an absolute king of kings, that is, Shaunano Shao, was popularized in the subcontinent by the Kushanas. And as you can see the far-reaching influence where, again, in period China, you would find this influence there as well. And then obviously through that in Korea, medieval Korea or Japan. But especially Korea and China, you find that heavily influenced there. And the Kushanas, they used it on their coins again to assert supreme authority over various lesser regional princes, right? So this exact steppe imperial structure transitioned seamlessly into the Persian Shahanshah or Badshah titles used by the Mughals and the Sultanates. Now, food and lifestyle. This is, again, going to be very interesting because, as I said, remember the nomads or what we refer to as the Aryans of the Indus Valley Civilization, the steppes originally, basically, who came and, lived in northern India and ruled over northern India. From all of their movement to and fro and their settling down in India, food and lifestyle obviously took a change. And so we had dairy processing and dried curds, right? Which is kurut and chakka. Now, here's the steppe reality here. Dehydrated salted curd balls, which are kurut, were a vital, long-lasting survival staple invented by the Central Asian pastoralists to preserve milk over long nomadic journeys. And in South Asia, the processing of strained, dense yogurt became deeply integrated into royal kitchens when the Persian Empire came, the Mughals and all. And it was given a Persian culinary rename like the chakka, or incorporated into Persianized cream bases, making it rustic, basically turning that rustic nomadic origin into Persian origin. So as you see, the Persians weren't behind the yogurt either, or those curd balls. So if you look deeper into this historical shift, you will realize that there's also archaeological evidence showing how these steppe people looked before Persian influence. And then you would, also understand how military weapons also got influenced. Again, how the Persians were influenced by those military weapons made by the Central Asians or the steppes, the nomads, and all that. So, as I said, I even did a detailed post on social media on the shalwar kameez, for example, because again, although the idea, as I said, because they're all very close, the borders are very close to each other. So a lot of the dressing that you would find amongst the Central Asians, especially amongst their elites, you would find similar dressings in the Persian Gulf and, even in certain other places within this whole region. But the thing is, the lifestyle of the people of the nomads, especially the steppe nomads, their lifestyle, because they moved a lot, they journeyed a lot, they traveled a lot, their clothing and their lifestyle, their foods, it seems to have resonated, I guess, with most of the people in northern India or present-day Pakistan. So much so that even the clothing, for example, the shalwar kameez, which we always say is a Pakistani garment, yes, it became, at the end of the day, a wholly, completely Pakistani garment, because even though Indians also now have begun to wear it because it is so comfortable, that is the whole point of how it became a garment that was unique to this part of the subcontinent, is because, as I said, it can also be traced back to the steppe roots, the nomadic roots, and that was that the nomads, the horse riders, they needed clothes that they could move freely in. So the jama style, the pajama, which the West, by the way, borrowed. So the West did not just borrow the waistcoat, but they borrowed the sherwani also, the idea of a sherwani, which they turned into their long, which you see your modern westernized long coats and all. They are also basically influenced from the sherwani. And then the pajamas in the West also, which now they've been using as nightwear, was originally again influenced from this part of the world. Where again the Persians were a similar style, and the Mughals, and then, but again, as I said, in our case, it was the shalwar that we got, which was originally called the chalana by the steppes, by the Central Asians, and actually not even by them, but by those who had become native to India, And again, because the Persians saw a similarity in the shalwar, so in the chalana with their the looser versions of their pajamas, they're like, oh, this is so similar to so we call it salwar. So that's how they called it salwar, but we call it shalwar. Okay, so that's the difference again here. So shalwar then became heavily rooted as obviously a Pakistani, it is the Pakistani national dress. Why? Because in the whole of Pakistan, despite all the different ethnic groups and all the different tribes, you will notice one thing in common, and that is the various, styles of shalwar kameez. But at the end of the day, it boils down to the fact they are all similar garments to each other. They're all essentially different forms of shalwar kameez. So be them the Pathans or the Balochis or the Sindhis or the Punjabis, you will see various forms of this shalwar kameez, And again, as I said, this is our steppe origins, right? So here I think we can come to, before I forget, let's come to the embroidery, because that is another thing I wanted to discuss. As I said, if you want to know if a garment or an embroidery or a style is purely, truly ethnic, as in, is it unique to India? Can it be called Indian? You look at the names. As I said, the names themselves will tell you that these were things that were brought into India either by the Muslim empire or by the steppes before them. Right, so clothings, we've seen that the essential clothing of the kurta, the tunic, the sherwani, the waistcoat, they are basically Central Asian, right? And because they had similarities to the Persian wear, so they were, Persianized in their name. But here are certain things that again Indians like to call ethnic, but again these were now things that were actually introduced originally by the Mughal, the Mughals or the Persians, or basically the Muslim Empire. For example, here is an embroidery that we know, Tarkashi. See, the name itself tells you the name is Persian. Remember, I just talked about Tarkash. So yeah, from there, Tarkashi. So derived from the Persian words tar meaning wire and thread, which is also in Urdu obviously, and then kash, extraction. So tar kashi, right? So this is a drawn thread and pulled work technique practiced indigenous sorry, I'm fumbling right now, indigenously in South Punjab and Rajasthan rather than a nomadic steppe tradition. Right? Now this, despite the fact again that it is derived from Persian words, but you will notice that this is indigenous to South Punjab and Rajasthan, both again heavily, under the Muslim, you can say it was, they were predominantly Muslim populated. And then you have chikankari, which we just generally in Pakistan we refer to it as chicken. Right? So commonly thought to derive from the Persian word chicken, meaning an embroidered fabric, or possibly chick referring to the jali-like patterns. It matured into its famous form under the Nawabs of Oud in Lucknow, heavily synthesized with local Indian flora and Mughal aesthetics. So here is where you get the fusion of the local Indian and the Mughal aesthetics. And so this is where, as I said, you will see a lot of things that may have been originally influenced by the Muslim empire, but they were made subcontinental, or they were made Indian by the Muslim elites of those times. Then you have the Shiro Shakar, which we generally refer to in Pakistan as the Shakar, right? Now, the Shakar, as you know, in Pakistan especially, you have these extremely expensive shawls in which the Shakar shawls, and now, in fact, if you go to Salim Fabrics, for example, they even have saris made of Shakars. And the thing is, once again, this is derived from Persian for milk and sugar, right? Which was basically, Shiro Shakar, So Shiro Shakar became Shakar, and then we call the technique Shagari, right? Now, it traditionally refers to a lightweight, puckered textile or weaving style, which is called the seersucker, basically. You refer to it as that, with alternate smooth and crinkled stripes rather than a nomadic steppe embroidery, again. But by the way, I specifically love this style in the fabric. It's very, very soft, despite the, the parts that are crinkled, they tend to be a bit, but otherwise very soft. Now, here are the core differences, okay, where you have the between the Persian influenced or the Mughal influenced and the steppe nomads influences, okay. So the steppe cultures focused historically on heavy wool, felts, leatherwork, and functional or geometric surface embellishments suited for mobile, cold climate existence. Remember? Movement, nomads. But the Persianate South Asian court crafts, with the techniques like chikankari, tarkashi, zardozi. Yeah, zardozi is another one, And then, we also have zari. Zari is another work that is very popular. But again, the name itself tells you that this is also influenced by the Muslim empire, or the Muslims that came from that part. And so these techniques, they represent sedentary, highly refined court and urban textile traditions. So they adopted Persian vocabulary because Persian was the language of the administration, culture, and high art during the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal periods, even though the physical craft evolved locally in South Asian workshops. Now, again, you will think that I am just now contradicting myself, because I just said that they came from the Muslim empire, and then now I'm telling you that they evolved locally in social Asian workshops. Let's go a little bit further into that. Right. So, as I said, they were heavily influenced by the Mughal rule, by the Muslim rule, and then we're talking about how they were, how they originated from the South Asian local workshops. And here's the relationship is, basically it was a dynamic system of patronage. So you had the Mughal rulers who did not bring these crafts ready-made from Persia, but instead they catalyzed a fusion of existing local Indian techniques with Persian aesthetics. Okay, for example, before the Mughals, right, the Indian artisans already possessed advanced skills in fine cotton weaving, dyeing, and basic white-on-white embroidery, right? Which the white-on-white embroidery or the self-embroidery we tend to see a lot in chikankari, right? And then or in chicken fabric. And then the weaving, the cotton weaving is, yes, definitely something that is South Asian. And the dyeing, especially as we know the tie and dye type of ikat prints and all, the chunri, which the Indians call the bandhani, these are native, right, to South Indian, how do we say, to the South Indian culture? Okay, let's put it this way. And then, sorry, was interrupted by a message. It was apparently an important message that I had to pass through. So, right, as I was saying, now we look at the geographic hubs. So regions like Bengal, Gujarat, and the Punjab, they had centuries-old traditions of textile production driven by local trade and climate needs. Don't we know that? Seriously, talk about climate needs. Okay. Now, then we have ancient references where early texts mention kashida, which is embroidery, and structural open work, proving that the basic physical mechanics of needlework existed in India long before the 16th century. Now, how did the Mughal influence come here? You had the Mughal transformation, the catalyst, where basically the karkhanas, the workshops, the imperial karkhanas or the imperial workshops were established by the Mughal emperors, and they brought local artisans together under one roof, providing them with expensive raw materials like fine Dhaka muslin and silk threads. And then the Persian designers came in. How did the Persian designers came in? The courts employed Persian artists and calligraphers to design patterns. So these designers introduced the paisley, the jali, which is the lattice, and stylized floral motifs that you tend to see in Persian miniature paintings, right? Then we had the artisanal adaptation. So the local artisans took these Persian paper designs and they translated them onto fabric using their traditional hand skills. So to please the court, they refined their coarse local stitches into hyper fine, delicate movements. And that is where you get the Mughal influence, or the Muslim emperor's influence. Then we had the linguistic shift. So because Persian was the official language of the Mughal court and the administration, so the refined products were given Persian names like chicken curry or tarkashi to appeal to royal buyers, replacing older local terminology. And as we now we'll go into the evolution of specific crafts, and why they exist till date and why they hold such, imperial importance even today. Imperial in the sense that how they are considered royal and part of our ethnic, again our ethnic vibe, you can say. So let's begin with chicken curry, because as we know, especially in India, people literally just they would do anything to get their hands on chicken curry, right? Because it's handmade embroidery and all. To be honest, in Pakistan we never considered chicken so luxe, because to be honest we find it very easily, and it's our own. We actually have the concept of chicken fabric. So it's not just the chicken curry, we actually literally have chicken fabric. So we tend to use that more, just FYI. Okay. And also, by the way, let me tell you, chicken, what we refer to as chicken or chicken curry, is also very, very common, and in most embellished in the sense their designs are more complicated, more intricate, and more unique in Nigeria. I don't know about the rest of West Africa, because I've lived in Nigeria, so I can tell you that in Nigeria, oh yeah, I mean the heavily chicken fabric clothes that we had, and when we came to Pakistan and people were like, oh my god, where did and we were like, oh okay, in Nigeria too actually it was very, very common. Chicken fabric with elaborate chicken, complicated, full on chicken designed fabrics, they were pretty common at that time. So don't know about that, seriously, don't know how that got there, but anyway, so our chicken is very different, more fine, more more fine, you can say, as in even our chicken fabrics in Pakistan, you tend to see a little bit of more like a motif sort of a thing going through the fabric. It's not like the whole fabric is filled A to Z with chicken and that you cannot even see the fabric underneath, you know what I mean? But in Nigeria it was like that. Okay, so where chicken curry in South Asia is concerned, okay, let's just put it this way, our chicken curry, it is that the legend credits Noor Jahan, the Emperor Jahangir's Persian wife, with introducing Turkish Persian white embroidery styles. However, Lucknow workshops local to India perfected the unique 36 distinct stitches, combining flat, raised, and net-like textures, creating something entirely distinct from the original Persian needlework. And that is why we tend to then call it ethnic. It may have been influenced by the Turkish Persian white embroidery. As we know, Nur Jahan was famous for introducing a lot of such things as in fashion, which today we would call high couture, but she was behind a lot of trends and fashions, and artists, and she was a patron of a lot of fine arts, you can say, productions. Okay, then we have the Tarkashi. So the local artisans in the Punjab and Rajasthan regions adapted the traditional geometric pulled thread work to mimic the intricate stone jali screens found in Mughal architecture. Right, jali or screens, by the way, any net-like thing, any net-looking thing is a jali. Okay, so yeah, I mean, we're not going to go too further in, but I mean, this is just to explain how, while it was influenced by the Muslim empires, but again, you would see the work of the local being transitioned, being influenced, and then being finessed, and then progressing, and then advancing, and then turning into something. And then once again, because Persian was the official language, so giving them Persian names, even though their origins may well be just a fusion of local South Asian and Turkish Persian, two different types of embroidery styles, right? So yeah, this is as I said, how things become then Persianized, and then people start thinking that, oh, we're the original inventors of this and that. I'm sorry, but you're not. Because as I said, if the Persians were one of the oldest civilizations in the world, so were the Mesopotamians. In fact, I found it very funny that they were trying to put Mesopotamia under Persians too. Look, the Mesopotamians later on may have come under Persian rule or something, but Mesopotamia on its own, when it was Mesopotamia, it was an empire on its own, it was a civilization on its own, and it was definitely not Persian. I'm sorry. I don't care how you like to put it, it wasn't Persian. Okay, so the Mesopotamian, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, the Chinese, the Indians, these are all some of the oldest civilizations. And yet you will notice that even though, as we said, the Indus civilization is actually one of the oldest civilizations. So the Indus Valley Civilization again comes from where? The nomads. The nomads came from where? Central Asia. They were the steppes. They were the kashanas. They were the Scythians, basically. So there were the Indo-Scythians as well. So I mean, so here you have this, and this is why, the Aryans were referred to as, again, local to the subcontinent, because on this side, which is now Pakistan, or which you would originally call northern India, that this whole side was basically where these people lived, thrived, and there are ancestors. Yes, good to know that too. So that is why we are where we are today, and that is why things are the way they are today. So yeah, I mean, just telling you that this is how, whenever a ruler comes, for example, like Urdu, we call it Urdu. But now everybody's going to fight and say, no, because the British, they popularized Hindustani. And so, yeah, I'm sorry. Hindustani, Urdu existed before the British came, right? Why did they popularize it? Because it was easy. Why was it easy? Because it was made to be easy. Why was it made to be easy? Because it was made by the Muslim rulers, because they had soldiers coming from completely different civilizations, completely different countries, completely different ethnicities. And so some were Turkish, some were Persian, some were Arabs, some were Indian. So they had to be able to have one common language. Again, that was not something that the indigenous Indians, you could say, were used to, because in India there are so many languages, and every few kilometers you would go, a different language would start. It's basically like that, or a different dialect of one language would start. Punjabi alone has several different dialects. You leave Lahore, you just go a few kilometers ahead, and you will hear a completely different Punjabi, right? So India being basically a vast subcontinent, and originally India not being one country. You must remember that India was never one country. That's the reason why it's better to always call it a subcontinent, because it was put together under the Mughal rule as one country. The Muslims, when they came and when they started ruling India, that is when they made India what we know today as India, or what we know as the subcontinent. So they are the ones who united the whole India. Before that, these were all different warring states, and that is why there was no concept even of a common language. Again, the concept of a common language was brought in by the Muslim rulers. And so first you had the Persian language, which became the common language used by the rulers and in the court and in the administration. So it became the official language. It became the official language, right? And then it became the common language of the Muslims of the subcontinent. They used Persian to communicate with each other. And within the soldiers, what the Muslim rulers did was they made up one language in which they picked some words from Turkish, they picked words from Arabic, they picked words from Persian, then they picked words from the original base language of Urdu, and they formed Urdu, which was the language of the soldiers, basically. And now, what is the base language of Urdu? That is Khari Boli. Okay? Yeah. So it was basically a dialect spoken in the upper Ganga, Yamuna, Doab, and Delhi region, and it was called Khari Boli. That is the mother dialect. Okay? That is the mother dialect. And over 99% of Urdu's verbs, pronouns, and grammatical structures come directly from this local Indic base. Okay? But then, as I said, so taking this as the base, taking the mother dialect, the Khari Boli, as a base, then what they did is that they added Arabic, they added Persian, they added Turkish, and they turned it into this one common language where everybody can find words in it that they could relate to or resonate with. But the grammar, the syntax, and the structural base are entirely indigenous to South Asia. It's basically taken from the original mother language, okay, which is the Khari Boli. So it is linguistically an Indo-Aryan language. Okay, so there you are. So what I'm trying to say is that although we may like to make things easier and call everything Indian, that is not entirely correct. And similarly, as I said, the names themselves will tell you that if this is indigenous to India or not, or if this is a fusion of something that was indigenous to India and, brought in by the Muslim empire, or if it was something that was brought in by the Central Asians, who basically made the whole Indus Valley Civilization, in their own right. So, the Aryans. So this, okay, now before any other confusion comes here, oh my God, trust me to again make, this is what happens when you talk about something, then one word sticks to your mouth and you keep on saying that same word over and over again because you're so, your mind is so focused on talking about that particular subject, and then you make a whole huge ass mistake in that. And then I just suddenly realized, I'm like, hold on, why am I constantly saying that the steppes founded the Indus Valley Civilization when actually they didn't? Actually, once again, I just created a confusion here by making the most stupid mistake ever. And I was like, hang on, what am I saying? And then I had to go rewind it a bit, and I'm like, okay, how many times did I just say that? So here's a correction within here before anybody kills me, or before I kill myself anyway. But okay, so the steppes actually arrived way after the Indus civilization had already reached its peak and entered its decline. As I said, and that is where I think the whole fumble began, where I was saying something else and meaning something else, is when I said that you have the Indus Valley Civilization, which is one of the oldest civilizations as well, and then you have they were essentially farmers, and then they made the whole irrigation system and all, and then I moved on to keep on yapping about steppes. Okay, so here we come now, because if you look at the timeline, right, let's just establish the timeline. So the the Indus Valley Civilization flourished from roughly 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE, right? So as we know, if you look at the genetic evidence, it shows that the steppe ancestry only began to appear in the South Asian gene pool during the Bronze Age, which I literally just even said that, and then I went on and yapped about them being the Indus civilization. Okay, so between 2000 BCE and 1000 BCE, the fusion happened basically when these migrating steppe groups, when they arrived, they mixed with the post-Harappan local populations, right? Which is why I keep on saying that they are our ancestors, despite the fact that we basically are also descendants of the original Indus Valley Civilization, or we like to think we are, the people of Pakistan. But as I said, we are predominantly, as we keep on and on saying, that we are predominantly Central Asian in ethnicity for the most part, and that is where the steppe groups come in. So this historical synthesis eventually laid the groundwork basically for the later Vedic period, and the classical Indian culture, combining local agrarian traditions with incoming nomadic elements, right? So if you look at the the Indus Valley Civilization versus the Eurasian steppe nomads, you would notice that in the Indus Valley Civilization, as I said, they were highly, the settlement was highly planned. You had dense brick cities, and we can still see it today in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. The economy was advanced agriculture, maritime trade, and urban craftsmanship. And technology was complex grid systems, indoor plumbing, and covered sewer networks, which again we tend to always say, the British brought the sewer networks. But as we can see, the Indus civilization actually had a very, very complex system, and a very good plumbing system actually. That is a lot better than the modern plumbing systems, one would argue. And then if you look at the steppe nomads, what their settlement was, mobile pastoral encampments, living in tents, temporary shelters. Their economy was again pastoral, herding centered around cattle, sheep, horses. Their technology was chariots, horse riding gear, weaponry, portable metallurgy, right? So yeah, this is where, we come in. So basically the Indus Valley Civilization, if you look at the ancient DNA studies, which by the way, they seem to be still ongoing, but up till now what we've understood is that they have proved that the people of the Indus Valley had zero genetic ancestry from the Eurasian steppe pastoralists, and the civilization was built entirely by indigenous South Asian populations, they claim. Okay, and they say that when the scientists, when they mapped the DNA of the ancient individuals buried at major Indus Valley civilization sites, they found a unique genetic profile that was completely distinct from the steppe nomads. So the Harappan genetic makeup was a mix of ancient ancestral South Indian hunter-gatherers and an ancient Iranian-related lineage that split from the Western Asian populations long before agriculture even began. And that is where that is actually where the Aryan thing comes in. So the Iranian-related lineage is where the Aryan come in. Because if you remember, historically speaking, when the ancient Persian king wrote a letter in that he signed himself off as an Aryan. So steppe DNA is completely missing from these samples that these scientists collected, the DNA samples with regards to the Indus Valley Civilization. And so this kind of proved that the creators of the South Asia's first cities evolved locally without any migration from the northern grasslands, at least. So this is what the present although as I said, they were supposed, from the previous research and the previous studies that were done, we had reached the conclusion that they were predominantly Aryan. But now they have come to a new conclusion where they say, no, they were predominantly South Asian, as in indigenous, ancient ancestral South Asian hunter-gatherers and Iranian-related lineage. Now, one would argue that is that supposed to mean that, that again we had movement, nomadic movement, that's, and settlers? Because again, what we have studied all the years is that nomadic settlers came and then they, settled in, and then they began agriculture and this and that. And now new studies are proving that, oh no, they were actually local. And then you had the, Iranian related lineage that had long before become local, because they had long before split from the Western Asian populations. So this is something that keeps on, because as we know, research studies, they are ongoing. Until date, this is what we have found out. If you remember, there was this very popular theory or argument or claim made by Sir Mortimer Wheeler in the 1940s. He was a British archaeologist, and he proposed this very famous hypothesis that there was an Aryan invasion, and that the horse riding Aryan tribes from Central Asian steppes invaded South Asia around 1500 BCE and violently overthrew the peaceful urban Indus Valley people. And he famously accused the Vedic war god Indra of destroying the Indus cities, stating that Indra stands accused for the collapse of the civilization. But this theory was rejected over the last few decades. Extensive archaeological reevaluations proved Wheeler's invasion theory entirely wrong. First of all, they said there were no signs of war. They said that the skeletons Wheeler found showed no signs of military trauma or weapon wounds. Further analysis proved that they were hasty burials from different time periods, often related to catastrophic regional flooding, not a single massive massacre. Then no weapons or chariots were found. I mean, they found, there was no foreign weapons, mass armor, or horse-drawn military chariots, because as remember, we have been yapping about the whole steppe thing. And we've been talking about the chariots, and we've been talking about the weaponry, and we've been talking about horse riding, and also there was no such thing found there in the mature Indus Valley sites. So they figured that the real cause was basically a gradual collapse of the cities, driven by severe climate change. I was going to say climatic, severe climate change. So according to them, according to their studies over the decades, there were like a prolonged, centuries-long drought, and the drying up of major river systems like the Ghaggar Hakra forced the urban populations to abandon their cities and migrate eastwards into the Ganges plains. So the modern consensus is it was migration and not invasion. So today, historians and geneticists agree on a model of gradual migration rather than military conquest. So the conclusion that they've come about is that the Indus Valley Civilization was built independently by local South Asian populations, and long after these cities began to decline and de-urbanize around 1900 BCE, Indo-Aryan pastoralists from the steppes began migrating into the region in small, slow waves. Rather than a violent replacement, these incoming groups mixed with the remaining local post-Harappan populations over centuries, blending their cultures to lay the foundations of the later Vedic period. So, I mean, that's the conclusion now that they have reached. And so once again, I'm glad I caught myself, because I'm like, hold on, why am I constantly... But I mean, this is what happens, when you're so focused on talking about one thing, and you have to keep in your mind that, okay, I'm talking about this thing and I have to talk about and then you suddenly move on to another thing, and then it's like your mind is saying something else, but your mouth is saying something else, and thus begins the whole disinformation, misinformation, which is not deliberate disinformation, misinformation, but the kind that happens when your mind and your mouth do not coordinate. So I hope I got that done. But basically what I was trying to talk about, because as I said, my whole topic here was not about the Indus Valley Civilization or about the steppes and all. My whole point of this podcast was understanding how when rulers come and they bring in their own influences, then we tend to discard many things that were originally indigenous, or we tend to then make many things that were influences into indigenous, and they both, can become a problem. For example, as I said, my main problem was when the Indians of today keep on and on saying, oh, this is ethnic Indian, this is ethnic, and they had a problem with those who correctly said that this is subcontinental, because it is subcontinental. I'm sorry, it is what it is. Okay, clothings like sherwani, like the kurta, like the shalwar and all, these are, these are not indigenous to India, ethnic India, so they can now be referred to, when you're referring to them now as Indian, you're dumbing it down. Okay, so it's always better when you say South Asian, and actually it's even much better when you say subcontinental, because as we know, when fusions occur and things become unique to that country that is fused to them, then it doesn't matter, at the end of the day. You can say that it's influenced by so and so, or it was influenced by the steppes, or it was influenced by the Persians, or it was influenced by the Arabs, or whatever, but it is no longer belongs to them, because it has now turned into a completely different thing. But to again say that, oh, it is indigenous to India, is also completely wrong. And similarly, for Persians to claim that everything is Persian influenced is like the Chinese who claim everything is Chinese influenced. That is very wrong. We need to, try to understand that. Well, this is me signing out. Khuda Hafiz.